May 15, 1889. The quiet farming community of Sand Lake, Michigan, when Martin Duram's neighbors finally forced their way into his farmhouse after 3 days of unanswered knocks. They discovered the 48-year-old farmer lying in a pool of dried blood on his bedroom floor, a single gunshot wound to the chest. His prized African gray parrot, Polly, sat silent in her cage, covered with a dark cloth, something Martin never did during daylight hours. But it was what happened 48 hours later that would shake the foundation of this tight-knit community. As investigators interviewed Martin's widow, Glenda Duram, in the parlor of their home, the parrot suddenly began to scream. Not bird sounds, human words, a man's voice pleading, "Don't shoot! Don't, Glenda! No, no!" The room fell silent. Glenda Duram's face drained of all color. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone in that parlor could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the parrot that witnessed a murder in 1889, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest corners. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the globe. Now, let's step back into the shadows of the Gilded Age, where a simple farmhouse held secrets that would expose the darkest corners of the human heart. The year 1889 marked a peculiar moment in American history. While industrialists built empires in cities like New York and Chicago, rural Michigan existed in a different world entirely, one where horse-drawn plows still turned the soil, where neighbors knew everyone's business, and where modern forensic science was nothing more than a fantasy confined to penny dreadfuls and detective novels. Sand Lake, Michigan, was a community of perhaps 200 souls, scattered across dairy farms and modest homesteads. The town consisted of a general store, a Methodist church, a one-room schoolhouse, and a grain mill along the creek. African Greys were known for their intelligence and their uncanny ability to mimic human speech with remarkable clarity. Polly became Martin's constant companion. She sat on his shoulder while he did paperwork, rode with him in the wagon when he went to town, and slept in an ornate cage in the couple's bedroom. The Durams' marriage appeared, to outside observers, unremarkable. They attended church regularly. Glenda served on the Ladies' Auxiliary Committee. Martin sat on the town council. They had no children, a source of quiet speculation among the church women, but otherwise seemed content enough. But in small communities, contentment can mask desperation. And in 1889, desperation wore many faces. The economic depression that had gripped America since 1873 still lingered in rural areas like Sand Lake. Farms foreclosed regularly, banks tightened credit. The future felt uncertain, pressing down like heavy storm clouds that wouldn't break. People made choices they might not have made in easier times. They took risks, they formed alliances, they kept secrets that festered in the dark. Martin Duram, it would later emerge, had secrets of his own, so did his wife. And Polly, the parrot with her obsidian eyes and gray feathers, had been watching, listening, remembering, escalating incidents. The first sign that something wasn't right in the Duram household came in February 1889, though no one recognized it as such at the time. Martha Henderson, who lived on the neighboring farm, later testified that she'd heard shouting coming from the Duram house late one evening. This wasn't particularly unusual, all couples argued, but the intensity troubled her. She couldn't make out words, only raised voices that carried across the frozen fields. A man's voice, angry and pleading. A woman's voice, cold and sharp as winter ice. Then silence. The next morning, Martha saw Glenda Duram at church services. She wore a high-collared dress despite the warm sanctuary, and Martha noticed what might have been a bruise on her neck, partially concealed by the fabric. When asked if everything was well, Glenda smiled tightly and said only, "Martin and I had a disagreement about finances, nothing that concerns anyone else." In March, the incidents escalated. Thomas Brennan, who operated the general store, recorded in his ledger that Glenda Duram had purchased rat poison on March 12th. This wasn't unusual in itself. Every farm dealt with vermin. But what struck Thomas as odd was the quantity. 3 bottles of arsenic-based poison. When he'd mentioned that 1 bottle should suffice for most infestations, Glenda had fixed him with an unsettling stare and said, "I have a particularly stubborn problem." The same week, Dr. Samuel Worth, the physician who served Sand Lake and 3 surrounding communities, was called to the Duram farm. Martin had been suffering from severe stomach ailments, cramping, vomiting, weakness. Dr. Worth examined him and diagnosed acute gastric distress, likely from spoiled food. He prescribed rest and bland foods. Martin recovered after 4 days. What Dr. Worth didn't know, what no one knew, was that Glenda had been carefully administering small doses of arsenic to her husband's coffee each morning. Not enough to kill him quickly, just enough to weaken him, to make him sick, to see if she had the nerve to go through with what she was contemplating. But Martin's constitution was stronger than she'd anticipated, and Polly, watching from her cage, absorbed every moment of the morning ritual. The way Glenda would glance toward the bedroom door, the careful measurement of powder from the dark glass bottle, the stirring, the false smile as she brought Martin his breakfast tray. "Here's your coffee, dear," Glenda would say in her sweetest voice, and Polly would cock her head and watch with those penetrating black eyes. By April, the tensions in the Duram household had become visible to more than just the neighbors. Reverend William Ashford, who had counseled the couple after they'd missed 2 consecutive Sunday services, later described Martin as haunted and Glenda as distant, as though her mind was occupied with matters she couldn't or wouldn't share. Martin confided to the Reverend that he suspected his wife was having an affair, though he had no proof, just a feeling. The way she would disappear for hours on shopping trips to Grand Rapids, the way she'd started locking the bedroom door when she dressed, the way she looked at him sometimes, with an expression that might have been contempt or might have been something worse, something calculating. Reverend Ashford counseled prayer and patience. He suggested that stress and financial pressures could strain even the strongest marriages. He had no way of knowing that Martin's suspicions were more accurate than he realized. Glenda Duram had indeed been traveling to Grand Rapids regularly since the previous autumn. But she wasn't shopping. She was visiting Charles Grayson, a traveling salesman she'd met at the train depot, a man with smooth hands and smoother words, who told her everything she wanted to hear. That she was beautiful, that she deserved better than a broken-down farmer and a lonely farmhouse, that they could have a life together if only circumstances were different. Charles had been married once before. His wife had died under mysterious circumstances in Ohio, a fall down the stairs that the local sheriff had investigated briefly before declaring it an accident. Charles had collected a modest insurance payout and moved west, always moving, always looking for the next opportunity. When Glenda confessed that she felt trapped in her marriage, Charles didn't encourage her to seek a divorce. He knew that divorce in 1889 was scandalous, expensive, and legally complicated. Instead, he planted seeds. Asked questions. What if Martin simply wasn't around anymore? Wouldn't it be easier if he just disappeared? I've heard arsenic can mimic natural illness if administered carefully enough. These conversations happened in rented rooms above saloons, in quiet corners of restaurants where no one knew their names. And each time Glenda returned to Sand Lake, she looked at Martin differently, not as a husband, as an obstacle. In late April, something changed. Perhaps Glenda lost her nerve for slow poisoning. Perhaps Charles pushed her toward more direct action. Perhaps Martin discovered evidence of the affair and confronted her. The truth of what precipitated the final act died with them. But neighbors would later recall that in the week before Martin's death, Polly's behavior had become strange. The Parrot, normally vocal and friendly, had fallen silent. When visitors came to the house, the bird would retreat to the back of her cage, feathers ruffled, making low, distressed sounds. Martha Henderson testified that she'd visited on May 13th to borrow flour, and Polly had looked at her and said, clear as day, don't. Just that one word repeated with what Martha described as human urgency. Martha had laughed it off. Birds said strange things. There was no way to know that Polly was repeating something she'd heard, a fragment of a conversation, a warning that went unheeded. On May 14th, Martin Duram spent the day working in his fields, planting corn. He came home at dusk, washed up at the pump behind the house, and sat down to dinner with his wife. They ate in silence. Glenda would later claim they weren't speaking after an argument about finances. After dinner, Martin went to the bedroom to read his Bible before sleep, his nightly ritual. Glenda followed 20 minutes later. She'd been holding his loaded shotgun. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. It helps us bring you more forgotten chapters of true American history. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries and real crime stories that time tried to bury. Let's discover what happens next in one of the most bizarre murder investigations of the 19th century. May 15, 1889, dawned clear and warm across Sand Lake. By mid-morning, neighbors noticed that Martin Duram's wagon hadn't passed by on his usual route to town. By afternoon, when his cows were bellowing from unmilked udders, concern turned to alarm. Thomas Brennan, accompanied by Martha Henderson's husband John, approached the Duram farmhouse at approximately 4:30 p.m. They knocked, no answer. They called out. Silence. The door was unlocked, unusual but not unheard of in this trusting community, and they entered. The scene that greeted them would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. Martin Duram lay on the bedroom floor, positioned between the bed and the dresser. His body had gone rigid with rigor mortis. A massive wound gaped in his chest, the entry point of a shotgun blast fired at close range. Blood had pooled beneath him, soaking into the pine floorboards, turning them nearly black. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling with an expression of profound shock. The bedroom showed signs of struggle. A lamp had been knocked from the nightstand. The bed covers were twisted and pulled half onto the floor. Martin's Bible lay open nearby, its pages splattered with blood, and in the corner, covered with a dark cloth, sat Polly's cage. The bird was silent beneath the covering. John Henderson, his hands shaking, examined the scene with what limited forensic knowledge a farmer possessed. The body was cold. Martin had been dead for hours, possibly since the previous night. The shotgun was missing, though John noticed shells scattered near the dresser. Martin's own ammunition, Thomas Brennan ran to fetch Sheriff William Thornton from the county seat 15 miles away. John stayed with the body, sitting on the front porch because he couldn't bear to remain in that blood-soaked room. While John waited, he heard something from inside the house, a voice. He assumed someone else had arrived, but when he checked, the house was empty except for the corpse in the covered birdcage. Then he heard it again, words muffled but distinct, coming from beneath the dark cloth. "Don't shoot." John approached the cage slowly. The voice didn't sound like a parrot's typical squawk. It sounded human, male, desperate. "Don't shoot. Don't, Glenda. No, no." John jerked the cloth off the cage. Polly stared at him, head tilted, and then repeated the words again in a perfect imitation of Martin Duram's voice, a voice John had heard 1,000 times over the years they'd been neighbors. The parrot wasn't just mimicking random sounds. She was recreating Martin's final moments, the words he'd spoken as he'd faced his killer. Sheriff Thornton arrived as sunset painted the sky orange and red. He was accompanied by Deputy Frank Morris and Dr. Samuel Worth, who would serve as coroner. The three men examined the crime scene by lamplight, taking notes, making observations that would later form the basis of the murder investigation. Dr. Worth's preliminary examination revealed that Martin had been shot once in the chest from a distance of approximately 6 to 8 feet. The shotgun blast had been aimed slightly upward, suggesting the shooter had been standing while Martin was either sitting or kneeling, possibly beside the bed, perhaps praying before sleep. The wound had caused massive hemorrhaging. Death would have come within minutes, though not instantly. Martin had been conscious long enough to fall, to suffer, to speak those final words. "Where's Mrs. Duram?" Sheriff Thornton asked. That was when they realized Glenda was missing. A search of the house revealed her absence, but also uncovered several troubling details. Her clothes were still in the wardrobe, her personal items remained in the bedroom, but a small travel bag was gone, and Martin's cash box, usually kept in the bottom drawer of his desk, had been emptied. Approximately $200, Martin's savings from the past 3 years, had vanished. The shotgun was eventually located in a well behind the house, thrown there in an apparent attempt to dispose of the murder weapon. Sheriff Thornton retrieved it using a rope and bucket. The weapon was indeed Martin's own shotgun, one he kept for hunting rabbits and protecting his chickens from foxes. But the most damning evidence came from Polly. Throughout the evening, as investigators worked the scene, the parrot continued to repeat fragments of conversation. Sometimes it was Martin's voice, "Don't shoot." Sometimes it was a woman's voice, cold and resolute, "It's over, Martin." And once, chillingly, the bird mimicked the sound of the shotgun blast itself, a sharp crack that made every man in the room flinch. Sheriff Thornton, a practical man not given to flights of fancy, recognized the significance of what he was hearing. African gray parrots were known for their extraordinary ability to mimic sounds and voices. This bird hadn't just witnessed the murder, she'd recorded it. Every word, every sound, every terrifying moment. The question now was whether a parrot's testimony could be used to find and convict a killer. Investigation aftermath 9 minutes. The manhunt for Glenda Duram began within hours of the discovery of Martin's body. Sheriff Thornton sent telegrams to every station within 100 miles, describing the suspect, a woman in her early... Sheriff Thornton knocked on the door of room 14, and when a man's voice called out asking who was there, the sheriff identified himself and demanded the door be opened. Instead, he heard scrambling inside, footsteps rushing toward the window. Deputy Morris, positioned in the alley below, caught Glenda Duram as she attempted to climb down a drain pipe. She was wearing a nightgown and carrying a leather satchel. Inside that satchel, investigators found $183 in cash, Martin's savings, along with a train schedule to San Francisco. and 2 forged letters of reference claiming that Mrs. Gloria Durant was a widow of good character seeking domestic employment. The man in the room was Charles Grayson. He initially claimed he'd only met Glenda 2 days prior and knew nothing about any murder. But when Sheriff Thornton searched the room, he found letters, dozens of them, documenting months of correspondence between Glenda and Charles. The letters outlined plans for a future together. They discussed Martin as an impediment and a problem to be solved. One letter, dated April 28th, included the chilling line, "I cannot wait much longer. Every day with him feels like dying slowly." Both Glenda Duram and Charles Grayson were arrested and extradited back to Michigan to face murder charges. The trial of Glenda Duram began on July 8, 1889, in the Montcalm County Courthouse. It attracted significant attention throughout Michigan and beyond. Newspaper reporters from Detroit, Chicago, and even New York traveled to cover what they called the Parrot murder trial. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Harold Wentworth, built a methodical case. They established motive through financial records showing Martin's life insurance policy for $500, naming Glenda as beneficiary. They demonstrated opportunity through witness testimony, placing Glenda at home the night of the murder. They proved method by linking the shotgun to the Duram household and showing that only Glenda would have had both access to the weapon and knowledge of when Martin would be most vulnerable. But the case's most sensational element was Polly. D.A. Wentworth made a bold and unprecedented decision. He would introduce the Parrot's testimony as evidence. This had never been attempted in an American court. The legal questions were enormous. Could an animal's observations be admitted? Did the Parrot's mimicry constitute hearsay? Could the defendant's right to face her accuser be satisfied when that accuser was a bird? Judge Theodore Morrison ultimately ruled that while the Parrot could not testify in the traditional sense, the bird's mimicry could be demonstrated to the jury as circumstantial evidence of what occurred in the bedroom that night. The judge's reasoning was innovative. The Parrot was not a witness, but rather a recording device, no different from a diary or a phonograph record. The sounds she reproduced were facts to be evaluated by the jury alongside other physical evidence. On July 15th, Polly was brought into the courtroom in her cage. The room fell silent as Da Wentworth uncovered the bird and spoke directly to her. "Hello, Polly, hello." The Parrot cocked her head, studying the crowd of spectators with apparent interest. Then, without prompting, Polly began to speak. First in Martin's voice, "Don't shoot." The words echoed through the silent courtroom with eerie clarity. Several spectators gasped. 2 women had to be escorted out, overcome with emotion. Then Polly shifted to a woman's voice, Glenda's voice, though no direct comparison could be made in court. "It's over, Martin." And finally, most damningly, the Parrot reproduced an entire exchange. "Don't, Glenda, please. I can't live like this anymore. We can work things out. Please don't." The shotgun sound followed, that sharp crack that made the jury flinch collectively. Glenda Duram, sitting at the defense table, had gone pale as milk. Her attorney, James Sullivan, objected strenuously, arguing that the demonstration was prejudicial and unreliable. How could anyone know when the Parrot had learned these phrases? How could they prove the bird was accurately reproducing events from that specific night rather than fragments from earlier arguments? But the damage was done. The jury had heard what sounded unmistakably like a murder played out in real-time audio. Combined with the physical evidence, the financial motive, and Glenda's flight with her lover, the Parrot's performance became the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. The defense attempted to argue that Glenda had acted in self-defense. Sullivan claimed that Martin had been violently abusive throughout their marriage, that Glenda had lived in fear, that the shooting was a desperate act of survival. He called witnesses who testified to seeing bruises on Glenda's arms in years past, to hearing loud arguments from the Duram house. But the prosecution countered effectively. If Glenda had been defending herself, why had Martin been shot while apparently kneeling? Why had she stolen his savings and fled with a lover? Why had she attempted to dispose of the murder weapon? These were not the actions of a battered woman acting in the heat of terrified self-defense. These were the calculated moves of someone who had planned and executed a murder. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. On July 18, 1889, they returned a verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree. Judge Morrison sentenced Glenda Duram to life imprisonment at the Detroit House of Corrections. She would serve 18 years before dying of pneumonia in 1907, never once admitting guilt, maintaining until the end that she'd been defending herself from a violent husband. Charles Grayson faced separate charges as an accessory to murder. The prosecution argued that his letters and counsel had encouraged Glenda's crime, even if he hadn't been physically present. The evidence was less conclusive in his case. No law against writing suggestive letters existed, and his defense argued that passionate correspondence didn't constitute criminal conspiracy. The jury in Grayson's trial, however, was unsympathetic. They convicted him of conspiracy to commit murder, and he received a sentence of 15 years. He served 12 before being released in 1901. He disappeared from public records after that, presumably living under an assumed name to escape the notoriety. The question of what to do with Polly presented an unexpected dilemma. The Parrot had become famous, or perhaps infamous. Newspapers across the country had published illustrations of the parrot that solved a murder. Offers poured in from museums, circuses, and wealthy collectors wanting to purchase the bird. Sheriff Thornton, who had taken possession of Polly as evidence, faced a choice. He couldn't return the bird to Glenda. She was in prison. Martin had no surviving family. The bird was, legally speaking, property without an owner. In the end, Sheriff Thornton made a compassionate decision. He donated Polly to the Grand Rapids Public Library, where the bird lived in the reading room for the next 12 years. Library patrons would come specifically to see the famous parrot. Children would gather around her cage, asking her to say the murder words, which librarians discouraged, though it happened occasionally when Polly decided to perform. Polly died in 1901, approximately 17 years old, young for an African gray, which can live 50 years or more in captivity. Some speculated that the trauma of what she'd witnessed had shortened her life, though this is impossible to verify. The library had her body preserved through taxidermy, and she remained on display in a glass case until 1947, when changing attitudes about death displays led to her being placed in storage. She was eventually lost during a library renovation in the 1960s. The case established several important legal precedents. While no court since has admitted parrot testimony in quite the same way, the Duram trial established that non-traditional forms of evidence, recordings, photographic evidence, and eventually audio and video recordings, could be admitted in criminal trials if properly authenticated. In essence, Polly wasn't testifying. She was evidence, a biological recording device that had captured an event. Legal scholars have debated the case ever since. Some argue that the parrot's testimony was unfairly prejudicial and shouldn't have been admitted. Others contend that the physical evidence alone would have convicted Glenda regardless of Polly's courtroom performance. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. The parrot provided dramatic confirmation of what the other evidence already strongly suggested. Broader implications. The Duram case reverberated through American legal and cultural consciousness in ways both immediate and lasting. Within months of the trial, newspapers across the country published editorials debating the admissibility of animal-derived evidence. The case raised profound questions about the nature of testimony, the reliability of different forms of evidence, and the boundaries of legal innovation. From a legal perspective, the Duram precedent contributed to the evolving understanding of documentary evidence. In 1889, courts were still grappling with how to handle new technologies. Photographs were being challenged as unreliable. Telegraph communications raised questions about authentication. The idea that a living creature could serve as a recording device stretched legal thinking in productive ways. By treating Polly's mimicry as equivalent to a written or recorded document, Judge Morrison helped establish frameworks that would later accommodate phonograph recordings, films, audio recordings, and eventually digital evidence. The case also brought attention to the broader issue of domestic violence and women's legal rights in marriage. While Glenda Duram's self-defense claim was rejected by the jury, the defense attorney's argument exposed the reality that many women in 1889 had limited legal recourse when trapped in abusive marriages. Divorce was expensive, socially stigmatizing, and legally complicated. Women had few property rights. Many were economically dependent on husbands they feared. The Duram trial sparked conversations in Michigan's legislature about strengthening women's legal protections and expanding grounds for divorce. While progress was slow, it would be decades before substantial reforms occurred. Historians have traced several important legal developments back to public conversations initiated by this case. Interestingly, the case also affected the exotic pet trade. In the months following the trial, sales of African gray parrots surged. Newspapers reported that wealthy families wanted a parrot like the one in Michigan. Bird dealers capitalized on the publicity, advertising their parrots as intelligent witnesses and feathered detectives. This created a brief but profitable boom in parrot imports before public interest waned. The case inspired numerous works of fiction. Within a year, at least 3 penny dreadful novels featured parrot witnesses to crimes. Several stage plays incorporated the concept. Even Arthur Conan Doyle, writing in England, mentioned the case in a letter to a friend, calling it a fascinating example of how truth proves stranger than fiction. Perhaps most significantly, the Duram case established in the public imagination the idea that justice could come from unexpected sources. The notion that a bird, a creature without human consciousness or moral understanding, could nonetheless provide the key to solving a crime captured Victorian America's fascination with both natural science and moral order. The case also highlighted the risks of premeditation and the difficulty of executing a perfect crime. Glenda Duram's fundamental mistake was underestimating what her parrot might observe and reproduce. She hadn't considered that Polly, sitting silent in the covered cage, was listening, recording, preserving evidence that would ultimately condemn her. This raised unsettling questions about privacy and observation. If a parrot could witness and reveal a crime, what other seemingly innocent observers might be present in our most private moments? The case fed into growing anxieties about the loss of genuine privacy in an increasingly interconnected world, where telegraphs could transmit information instantly, and photographs could capture moments permanently. The Sand Lake community itself struggled to recover from the scandal. The Duram farm sat empty for 3 years before being purchased at auction. The new owners reportedly experienced such difficulty with curious trespassers wanting to see the murder house that they eventually dismantled the original farmhouse and built a new structure on a different part of the property. The bedroom where Martin died, floorboards still stained with his blood, was burned. Martha Henderson, who had heard the arguments and noticed the bruises, reportedly struggled with guilt for years. She told her daughter that she'd known something was terribly wrong in the Duram household but hadn't acted on her instincts. "I thought it wasn't my business," she said near the end of her life. "I was raised to respect the privacy of marriage, but privacy protected evil, and I'll carry that knowledge to my grave." The case served as a grim reminder that small communities, despite their illusion of transparency, could harbor profound secrets. Everyone had known the Durams. They'd sat in the same church pews, they'd bought supplies from the same store, they'd lived parallel lives that occasionally intersected, but no one had truly seen what was happening behind the walls of that farmhouse until it was far too late. What do you think pushed Glenda Duram past the point of no return? Was it desperation, ambition, or something darker in the human heart? Could Martin have prevented his own murder if he'd been more aware of the danger? And what about Polly? Did the bird understand what she'd witnessed, or was she simply mimicking sounds without comprehension? Leave your theories in the comments below. We read every one and love hearing your perspectives. If you found this story as chilling as we did, subscribe to Fierce Sermon for more lost chapters of American history, the dark corners that textbooks forgot and time tried to bury. We bring you true stories of mystery, crime, and the inexplicable every week. Share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries and true crime. And let us know, should we do more animal witness cases? History is full of them. Thanks for joining us in the shadows. Until next time, remember, the walls have ears, and sometimes those ears have feathers. See you in the next video.